Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Dean Cheng of the U.S. Institute of Peace about China's space program and the race to Mars. Then we dive into the economic and political uproar over DeepSeek and AI competition, the escalating feud between President Trump and former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley, and much more. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. And this episode of the Threat Status Weekly Podcast is brought to you by Nightwing. 40 years in the making, Nightwing is the new intelligence solutions company defining the edge of possible to advance our national security interests. Learn more at nightwing.us. Great show today, Guy. Dean Cheng from the U.S. Institute of Peace is here to talk about China and its space program, which is a fascinating topic and very timely, given the executive order by President Trump this week to build a major new U.S. missile shield that relies on space-based interceptors. We'll get into all of that later, but before we do, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It is great to be here for another week on the podcast with you. Off the top, I'm tracking Secretary of State Marco Rubio's trip to Central America. This is his first travel abroad as America's top diplomat. He's making stops in Panama as well as Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic. Two key points here, Ben. Rubio will meet in El Salvador with President Nayib Bukele, who has very aggressively cracked down on crime and gang activity in that country since being elected there in 2019. Bukele is emerging as one of the Trump administration's big friends or top allies in Latin America. Part of Rubio's meeting with him is going to be about securing an agreement from Bukele to take in illegal immigrant deportees from the United States, including possibly alleged members of the Venezuelan criminal gang Tren de Agua. This is something we're tracking at Threat Status. The second key point, Ben, is that the State Department's new top spokesperson, Tammy Bruce, says that a focal point of Mr. Rubio's Panama stop is essentially to show a U.S. flex against growing influence had in Panama by China. It's noteworthy that Rubio is making this his first foreign trip. It's symbolic, and it dovetails with his assertion during his confirmation hearing a few weeks ago that China has established so-called dual-use port facilities on both ends of the Panama Canal that Rubio says may currently be economic, but could be quickly militarized by Beijing to control the vital shipping through the canal if tensions were to rise dramatically suddenly between the U.S. and China. In some sense, Ben, this may be fear-mongering, but it fits with concern that's been growing in recent years within U.S. intelligence and military circles about expanding Chinese government-backed activities in several Latin American nations. Readers of the Threat Status newsletter will have seen my story from a few months back, citing U.S. intelligence claims that at least 11 China-linked space facilities have been established in the region, providing Beijing with space tracking and surveillance capabilities. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Washington think tank, published a commentary last year warning that the space facilities could provide Beijing with critical support for the potential deployment and guidance of hypersonic missiles over the Western Hemisphere. This is the kind of the context behind the new administration's infatuation, or let's say the administration's focus on flexing diplomatic muscles in the region right now. One more thing on my radar, Ben, since we're already on China, It was definitely eye-opening in recent days how the Chinese artificial intelligence firm DeepSeek soared to the top of Apple's App Store and ranked as the most downloaded free app, just ahead of California-based OpenAI's ChatGPT. This is a development that has not only sent shockwaves through the American AI market, but it's also prompted unease within the U.S. national security community. This all fits with the so-called U.S.-China race for global data dominance. Things like who shapes historical narratives online. Our sources at Threat Status cite concern that the Chinese government's intelligence apparatus may seek to use DeepSeek to refine and improve its ability to censor online content globally and amass global user data. Users so far report that the DeepSeek chatbot restricts answers to questions about the 1989 massacre of pro-democracy demonstrators at Tiananmen Square in Beijing. I think it's interesting to point out that DeepSeek's user policies say that the platform automatically collects certain technical information on users, including keystroke patterns and rhythms. Ben, we can all speculate about what AI may be able to do with such data in the evolving information warfare domain.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there's lots of China-related news here all over the place. You mentioned hypersonic weapons. That, of course, is a key part of this, Trump Iron Dome for America proposal, which we're going to talk about a little more with Dee and Cheng later. But the ability to counter a potential hypersonic weapons attack by China is a key piece, key justification for the administration's push for what it calls the Iron Dome for America. And speaking of U.S. defense, there's a lot happening in the building where I used to spend a good bit of my time. The Pentagon. Pete Hegseth is in as the new defense secretary. General C.Q. Brown is still there for now, at least, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. President Trump is trying to bring back thousands of troops discharged for refusing the COVID vaccine a few years ago. They're dismantling DEI programs across the ranks. The Pentagon paused most of its social media posts from individual military bases to combatant commands, everything in between, in order to better align the Pentagon's public messaging with the political priorities of the White House. This week, Trump signed an executive order directing Pete Hegseth to revise the Defense Department's policy on transgender troops. This is probably paving the way for a ban on their service. Like a lot of other things Trump is doing right now, much of this is going to find its way into court eventually. But there's another review that's unfolding now that's even more interesting to me inside the Defense Department. And we touched on this a little bit, Guy, last week about how the portrait of former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley had been taken down from a hallway inside the Pentagon. And listeners might remember that I wondered aloud whether that was the end of this, whether the Trump administration and Trump himself, who has long-standing animosity towards Milley, would basically move on. And we got our answer just a few hours ago as we taped this on Wednesday. This week, Defense Secretary Hegseth pulled Milley's security clearance and his protective security detail. Milley had the security detail because of credible assassination threats from Iran, just as former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former White House National Security Advisor John Bolton, other folks, they did as well, and they had theirs canceled as well. But with Milley, Guy, this is going to go further. Hegseth ordered the Pentagon's Inspector General to conduct a review of Milley's conduct while he was Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman. He retired as a four-star general, of course, and what this review effectively could do is result in a demotion after the fact. He could lose a star in retirement, essentially, if this goes to what looks like to be its logical conclusion. So this is a big deal. Listeners are probably familiar with, I think, at least some of the Trump-Milley saga, but the quick version is this. Milley was with Trump during that infamous walk in the summer of 2020 during the nationwide protests after the killing of George Floyd out of the White House to Lafayette Square. And Milley later apologized very publicly and said he shouldn't have been with Trump. So that was kind of ground zero, if you will, for tension between those two, a public break between those two men. In Bob Woodward's most recent book, Milley is quoted as calling Trump a fascist to the core. And specifically what the Trump administration objects to is Milley's phone calls to Chinese officials in October of 2020 before the election, and again in January after the election, in which he tried to assure them that the U.S. wasn't going to attack China. His account is that he was just doing his job. Critics say he was circumventing the chain of command. we could go on and on. There have been a host of incidents between these two. But the point is, Guy, this could get messy and really ugly. I wasn't sure if the Trump administration would really pick this fight with all of the other issues it's got going on its plate, all of the other initiatives on immigration, downsizing the federal government, everything it's doing. Did it really want to dedicate the time, energy to demoting General Milley after he's long since retired? Well, we got our answer. They do. And now the question turns to this, which is something I know I've asked you before on this show. Now, in light of this, does General Milley become this administration's John Brennan, a former high-level official from the military or the IC who essentially becomes the cable TV news foil of Trump? Does he want that role? I don't know, but at least as far as the Trump administration is concerned, Guy, this feud is far from over.
Yeah, it certainly is an eye-opening feud to watch play out, Ben. I want just away from the Pentagon for a second. There's another thing about Trump's initial muscle flexing from the Oval Office, mostly in the name of ending the previous administration's prioritization of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, DEI, pretty much across all government policy platforms. Trump has signed an executive order freezing U.S. aid for 90 to U.S. foreign aid for 90 days. This impacts organizations that do soft power projection around the world. Trump also put a freeze on a lot of federal grants inside the United States. The administration has also sent out a mass email calling on career government employees to either more or less commit to supporting his administration's policies or resign, and offering to pay them through, I believe it's the end of September. It's almost as if the new administration is pushing a giant reset button on the entire U.S. federal government.
And we are pleased to be joined now by Dean Cheng. Dean is a senior advisor to the China program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He's a renowned expert on Chinese political and security affairs, China's space program, and much more. And Dean's the author of the new book, China and the New Moon Race. It's a pleasure, Dean. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll get into some specifics as we go along here about space and U.S.-China competition. But I want to ask you kind of a big, broad question to start about how space is viewed inside China. You mentioned in the introduction of your new book that China has supplanted, the Soviet Union, Russia, as the world's number 2 space power. I'm curious, from a cultural, political, military, social point of view in China, is space just all about beating the U.S., or is there sort of a nationalistic, if you will, aspect to this as well, as there was in the U.S. in the 60s? We wanted to be the first on the moon to beat the Soviets, of course, but it also just made us proud to put an American flag on the moon. Does that feeling exist in China, or is this just all about security, technology, and being in a position to use space to defeat the U.S. if and when that's necessary?
So I think how China views space is a classic example of embracing the power of and. So to begin with, I don't think the Chinese have a particularly American-centric focus, because that makes it seem like, wow, it's all about us. And if we stop going to the moon or Mars, wherever, Chinese would say, well, then we'll move on. Instead, I think that the Chinese see space as incredibly important, as a symbol of how far China has come. If you're Xi Jinping, it's like, and that's on me. I got us here. And for the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party in general, and that's on us. We got us here. In 1957, at the start of the space age, Sputnik goes up. China is a country that cannot build a rocket. China is a country that isn't even building its own airplanes. China is a country that barely can make maybe some automobiles. This is a country that is poor. And fast forward to today, China is the number 2 space power. That's an enormous leap. It involves so many different changes. It involves industrialization. It involves making the country richer. It involves teaching, educating people so that you have PhDs in aeronautics and electrical engineering and all the rest. And the CCP rightly says, that's us. We made this possible. And then you have the reality that in 1957, China is a poor country, and the people are feeling that way. China is not the third power behind the U.S. and Soviet. It's way in the back of the pack. Britain, Germany, all these countries, much wealthier, much more capable in 1957. And again, this is saying, look at how far China has come. Europe, you don't have a human spaceflight program. Russia, the former Soviet Union, we have more satellites, better capabilities, more money than you do. So it's nationalism, it's pride, it's overcoming past weakness, and it is a signal to the United States. We're not in this because of you, but we have our sights set that when we're talking about equals, we're your equal.
What do you make, Dina, of this renewed focus on getting to Mars? I mean, Trump, of course, President Trump talked about planting the flag on Mars in his inaugural address. Elon Musk talking about it. Jared Isaacman, the soon to be expected to be NASA administrator, talked about it at the Space Power Conference in Orlando last month, which I attended. So number one, is this something that could actually happen in our lifetimes? I'm 40 years old. Could this happen before I die? And number two, does China also want to get there? And is there any chance they could do it before us?
So first off, is it feasible? I think that what we have seen is if you pour enough money into things, there aren't any, as far as I know, laws of physics. Commander Montgomery Scott is not going to come out here and say, Captain, I kind of change the laws of physics here. You can't go to Mars. No, but there are some real serious engineering issues, Scotty's realm, about the radiation that will occur, about protecting the astronauts during a 18 to 24 month voyage there and then back. These are things that I think are doable. I'm not an engineer, I should say that up front, but how hard is it to overcome these is less clear. I'm older than you are. I will duck the question, how much older? So I would say that in your lifetime, I think, yes, if there is a consistent effort to do so. And this is the difference between us and the Chinese. When the Chinese say they are going to do something, officially, not some random, even government bureaucrat, but when the government of China says we are going to do X and we are going to do it by Y, that means the money spigot is open, the priority spigot is open, the human and financial and industrial spigots are open, and they will, by God and Mao, do it.
And that wouldn't change even after Xi Jinping?
Look at the human spaceflight program of today of China with the Shenzhou and Tiangong, the Shenzhou spacecraft and the Tiangong space station. Do you know when that project began? 1992. Actually, 1988 was when they were debating, but 1992 is the formal documentation. That means that this program, which today has Chinese astronauts orbiting in a Chinese-made space station, has been ongoing for 30 years. That is Deng Xiaoping, that is Jiang Zemin, that is Hu Jintao, and that is Xi Jinping. Big projects like this is not a whim of Xi or even Deng Xiaoping. This is we, the CCP, as a collective, commit to doing this. I mean, LBJ and Richard Nixon fulfilled Americans landing on the moon because of a martyred president. It's a good question. If Kennedy hadn't been assassinated, would we in fact have achieved his goal of putting an American on the moon by the end of this decade? When Xi Jinping says this, when Deng Xiaoping says this, when Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao say this, they are not speaking for themselves. In this aspect, they are speaking in their capacity as head of the party.
Just this week, President Trump, as you well know, of course, signed an executive order to establish the, quote, American Iron Dome, unquote, which would be a new missile shield that relies heavily on space-based interceptors to stop ballistic cruise, even hypersonic missiles before they could strike the U.S. You've had some critics say this is a fool's errand. It's too expensive. It won't work. You can't stop hundreds or thousands of Russian or Chinese missiles fired at the U.S. at the same time. Where are you on this? Is this idea of a space-based, Iron Dome practical to implement, and is it the solution over the long term as things like hypersonic technology keep improving?
One, I really, really wish President Trump hadn't used Iron Dome as his terminology because it gives people the wrong impression. Iron Dome.
And critics latched onto that term and said, well, we don't need what the Israelis have. We don't need to take down mortars and rockets fired at the U.S.
Right, exactly. So that's the first problem, is that Iron Dome creates the image of a ground-based interception system, which by definition is just going to be harder and more expensive. Two, one of the things that people have failed to recognize is the radical changes in two key components: computer processing and cost to orbit. Why does cost to orbit matter? Because thanks to Elon Musk, we have gone from in 1982, when Ronald Reagan started talking about Star Wars, it cost almost $20,000 to put a kilogram, 2.2 pounds, into orbit. Today, thanks to Falcon Heavy, it costs between $1,000 and $2,000. When Starship works, and I think he's somebody who will pour the money in to make it happen, we're talking about under $1,000 to put a kilogram in orbit, 1/20th the cost. But you're still talking about interceptors, right? Okay, but interceptors only work because of sensors and all that sort of stuff. The warhead's the least expensive part. In 1982, think about this, 2 years before the Apple Macintosh comes out, your computer is probably a Commodore 64K with a tape drive, all right? Any of your listeners have an Apple Watch? An Apple Watch today has more processing power than a Pentium 4. A Pentium 4 has literally orders of magnitude more processing power than your Mac 256K or certainly your Commodore. So what that means is on a rapidly dropping cost to orbit, I can put a much more capable set of sensors in the same weight. I can discriminate, I can differentiate, I can sense things. That combination means that you've gone from Star Wars defense, which was impossibly expensive, to highly expensive and maybe just plain expensive. Now, is it worth it? It's not going to stop drones, but there are lots of things that won't stop drones. It's not, will it stop hypersonics? The president talks about doing boost phase intercept. That's an interesting challenge. And just because I can't stop polio, does that mean I shouldn't vaccinate against measles? Just because I can't protect my kid from a car accident, unless I strap them in carefully, does that mean I shouldn't strap them in at all? So I think that this, well, it won't stop everything, so let's not do it. Does anybody parent that way?
On that point, Dean, is the administration and Trump personally overselling this? Because if you talk about the Iron Dome, we need to have a full missile shield over the U.S. That does potentially, to those of us average listeners, average readers of the Washington Times who might not know all the technical details that you do, they're thinking, oh, Trump's going to protect the entire continental United States from everything all the time, full stop. And are we overselling this a bit here?
I think that that depends on who's doing the selling. I think that certainly there's overselling by supporters and underselling by critics. I think that we do forget, why hasn't China or the Soviet Union / Russia / Iran or anybody else attacked the United States? Because we still actually have ICBMs and ballistic missile subs and bombers and all that will schwack you back. The challenge has been, okay, but what if somebody fires one by accident, or two, in the case of North Korea or someplace, as a demonstration shot? Once it's fired, at this point, there's pretty much no defense at all. And one of the issues about overselling is many, many Americans believe we already have a missile defense. And that goes to the reality that people have been overselling a non-existent reality. So I think President Trump, what is he doing? He is actually going to try and give us some modicum of protection that the American people, for the most part, often believe we already have.
Hi, Dean. It's Guy Taylor. What more broadly than Iron Dome, what priorities should the U.S. have under the Trump administration over the next few years vis-a-vis space more broadly? I mean, the first Trump term saw the creation of the Space Force. Some of the sources we talk to say the Space Force still isn't properly funded. There's still some behind the scenes turf wars between Space Force and the other services. Other than missile defense, what are the most immediate space related priorities that you want to see embraced by the Trump administration?
So one of the things I would like to see, and frankly, I don't care about the outcome, is go left, go right. I don't care. Make a decision. Are we going to the moon? Are we going to Mars? Are we going to go to the moon and then Mars? Pick something. And to the incoming NASA administrator, to Mr. Musk, to President Trump, since you are in the process of overhauling the bureaucracy, try to make sure that whoever is in the bureaucracy is not only aligned with these objectives, but will stay aligned after you leave office. Because every incoming new president says, you know what, that was a really great plan my predecessor had, but I'm going to scrap it and we're going to start over with a study. There are probably miles of studies out there that go back and forth. Pick something, make it happen, because that is what the Chinese are looking for. The Chinese are saying, are you actually going to ever do anything? Or are you just going to try to talk us to death while we chug ahead? With regards to Space Force, missile defense and all that is important. But what really worries me is we're sort of like in that period shifting from World War I to World War II. In World War I, air warfare was knights of the air. Baron von Richthofen flies off against, Captain Brown or Eddie Rickenbacker, one-on-one, charging into battle. Cool. Hey, makes great movies. If you look at World War II, it's the operational level of war. It is air campaigns. It is a strategic bombing campaign. It is fighter sweeps, that sort of thing. And what worries me is I think that we are still worried about how does satellite A confront satellite B and what are the maneuvering. I think the Chinese, who have a really robust space force and more importantly are thinking about space war, are going to that operational level of, you've got your Eddie Rickenbacker in space, and I'm going to maneuver hundreds of satellites, and I'm going to just take you down. And by the time you figure that out, they're all gone.
Dean, to finish up here, I'm glad you mentioned that because I want to follow up on China more specifically. When I was at the Space Power Conference, I was at a briefing with Brigadier General Anthony Mastelier, the commander of U.S. Space Forces Indo-Pacific. He said this about China and what it wants to do in space. He said, quote, their specific goals are to be able to track and target U.S. high-value assets at the time and place of their choosing. That started with A2AD strategy, which is extended to the first island chain, now the second island chain, and eventually all the way to the west coast of California, unquote. So it's that last part, the west coast of California, that jumped out to me, obviously. Is that how you see it? Are we making a mistake sometimes in thinking about China's space-based capabilities only through the prism of what it wants to do in the Pacific, perhaps around Taiwan, when the reality might be that Beijing is thinking about ways to impact the U.S. much closer to home?
The funny thing about space, it doesn't just stop at somebody's borders. Space is a global and a beyond global factor. So the Chinese talk about the Space Silk Road. They have integrated space into their Belt and Road Initiative. They are building out three mega constellations for what's termed proliferated low Earth orbit. This is Starlink on steroids times 3. Okay. So the Chinese are talking about using space as a lever to both incentivize other countries, South America, Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, to accept Chinese investment, and conversely offering these countries, hey, sign up with us, sign up for a pipeline, we'll throw in a satellite receiver dish for free. That is very serious. And then the other piece of this is that as a result, you are talking about the Chinese being able to track, to observe globally. And that means air reinforcements from, let's say, a U.S. airbase could be tracked from when it takes off out of Missouri till it lands at Okinawa. It means that you are tracking carrier groups that might go from the Eastern Med through the Suez Canal out to the Eastern Indian Ocean. But it also means that the Chinese are trying to develop better understanding and surveillance of what's called cislunar space, all the way out to the moon. The Chinese are going to the moon. They're going to the moon with people. But unlike us, they're not going to be one and done. They're not going to plant the flag, say, hey, look at what we did. We're done. They are almost certainly going to want to establish a lunar base, which means regular lunar travel. And here's the ugly question. If the Chinese do 4 missions a year to the moon, and we do 1 mission every other year, what do you think the language of space traffic management around the moon is going to be? Because it's going to be really hard to argue, but you need to speak English. Because the Chinese are going to say, why? I'm the one who's here all the time. Where are you?
Dean Cheng, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
This episode of the Threat Status Weekly podcast is brought to you by Nightwing. 40 years in the making, Nightwing is the new intelligence solutions company defining the edge of possible to advance our national security interests. Learn more at nightwing.us.
And it's time now for Threats of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here domestically at home or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week. And Guy, my threat of the week is a shortage of Air Force pilots, which is something that really could come back to bite the U.S. in a major clash with China, for example. Now, listeners of this show may remember, as I brought up to several guests over the past year, that I'm not 100% sure we'll have any human pilots at all 10 or 20 years from now. But we've had some former Air Force officials and other experts who know more than I do say otherwise. But either way, we don't have enough of them right now, and that's a problem. Our colleague at the Times, Mike Glenn, wrote this week about a new policy paper from the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies that says the Air Force has been plagued by a persistent shortage of about 2,000 pilots for over 2 decades, particularly fighter pilots. And that's just to keep pace of where we've been, our current readiness level. When you start talking about what we need to stay ahead of China, many thousands more short the U.S. right now. Now, one quick word of caution, Guy, before I give it back to you, because you and I have been covering this for a long, long time. There's a major movement on Capitol Hill right now and in the Trump administration to dramatically boost the defense budget. And oftentimes papers like this, studies, warnings, dire predictions about how the U.S. is falling behind, sometimes it's used as part of a public argument, a justification for why we need to pour billions of new dollars into some capability. In this case, more fighter jets, pilots to fly them, more training. But still, there is some truth at the center of this without doubt. The Air Force does have a problem getting pilots and keeping them. I'd encourage listeners to go check out that Mitchell Institute paper. It's pretty eye-opening, and that's why it's my threat of the week right now.
That's so interesting, Ben. I would encourage listeners to form their own opinions as we try to present the facts of what's going on in as straight a way as possible. With that, I'll tell you that my threat of the week is that a new escalation in the Russia-Ukraine war may be imminent if it's not already happening. I think I've predicted this in previous threats of the weeks about a month and a half ago. Ukrainian forces said on January 29 that they had carried out their second successful drone attack on Russia's energy infrastructure in less than a week, claiming to have damaged an oil refinery east of Moscow. Register that for a second. East of Moscow, meaning some 500 miles deep inside Russia. This could put massive new strain on the Putin government. Strain that comes amid reports in recent days that India and China are cutting their purchases of Russian oil because of price increases triggered by U.S. sanctions that got leveled in early January. Donald Trump vowed to get the Ukraine war ended quickly, Ben. Maybe this is what the start of that looks like. My threat of the week is that a new escalation may happen before that.
Yeah, that's certainly a concern and something we're going to keep a very close eye on. Thank you very much for that. Huge thanks to Dean Cheng this week for coming on to talk about China and space. Fascinating discussion there. And thank you all for listening. Please go ahead, share this podcast with all of your friends, hit that subscribe button, and Guy Taylor and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.